Hi, I'm here with Dottie, and we're going to read the last and final chapter of Who Was Harriet Tubman? Chapter 7, Moses of Her People. Harriet went back to her house in Auburn, New York. Her parents were old and needed her. Other people came there for her help too. Even though black people were free, their troubles had not ended. They still did not have the same rights as white Americans. For instance, black people were not allowed to live in white neighborhoods, shop in stores owned by white people, or worship in churches that white people attended. Black children could not go to school with white children. They went to separate schools. Lots of white people would not hire black people to do a job. Many former slaves were poor or sick. They had no way to earn a living and nowhere to go. Harriet took them all in. She never said no. Harriet needed money to care for these people. How would she earn it? Here's a picture. Even though she had never learned to read or write, Harriet had an excellent memory. She remembered the smallest details. A white woman named Sarah Bradford visited Harriet in Auburn. Harriet told her many stories about slavery and helping people escape. Because she had memorized passages from the Bible, the way she told these stories was filled with drama and poetry. Harriet told Sarah about many trips on the Underground Railroad, the war, and her work as a nurse and a spy. In 1869, Sarah Bradford published Harriet's biography. It was called Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. All the money it earned would go to Harriet. That same year, Harriet married Nelson Davis. They had met when he was fighting for the North in one of the Black Brigades. Nelson was a handsome man, 20 years younger than Harriet. But he had come down with tuberculosis, a disease that affected the lungs. He needed caring for too. Harriet's first husband, John Tubman, had been killed in Maryland in 1867. Harriet had never really had the chance to make a home or raise a family with him. Nelson gave her another chance. After he got better, he worked as a bricklayer. The money he earned helped support the people in Harriet's care. Harriet always had more stories to tell, and she always needed money to take care of people. So Sarah Bradford wrote another book, Harriet Tubman, The Moses of Her People. It was published in 1886. More money came from the new book, but still, there never seemed to be enough. In 1888, Nelson Davis died. Harriet's parents had died a few years earlier. Now she was all alone again, but she kept working. She was already caring for several poor, old, or sick black people in her own home. But to care for more people, she needed a bigger house and more land. No, not content with what she was doing, she dreamed of something bigger. A hospital, a rest home for black men, for any black man or woman who needed it. Harriet earned money by raising vegetables on the land she owned and selling them door to door. When she stopped at a house, she was often invited inside. Sometimes she was offered her favorite drink, a cup of tea with butter. Ew, that's gross, Daddy. Sitting at the table and sipping the tea, she spun her tales from the past. She would describe a civil battle with these words. And then we saw the lightning, and that was the guns. And then we heard the rain falling, and that was the drops of blood falling. And when we came to get the crops, it was dead men that were reaped. Or she might talk about President Lincoln, who had been assassinated in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth. She remembered how an old man had responded to the death by saying, "We kneel upon the ground with our faces in our hands and our hands in the dust and cry to thee for mercy, O Lord, this evening." Sometimes she went even further back in time, telling stories she had heard in her own childhood about the slave ships that brought Africans to America. Stories about the whips, chains, and branding irons. Another way Harriet earned money was by giving speeches. Once she was asked to speak along with the famous women's rights workers Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The two women had worked together for years. They were working to prove that women were equal to men. They also worked to get women many new rights, including the right to vote. In the 19th century, only men could vote. Harriet was a good example of how women were equal to men. Couldn't she do all the things a man could do and more? Standing in front of the audience, she said, "I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years and can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." Now, did she really drive a train? Was the Underground Railroad a real railroad? No, it's just what it was called. Here's a picture of the three women giving their speeches. Now I'm going to talk a little blurb about the two other women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Susan B. Anthony at the First National Women's Right Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. The two became good friends and partners. Both believed women deserved rights equal to those of men. They wrote books and articles, gave speeches, and worked to spread their message of equality. They wanted to make sure women earned as much as men for doing the same jobs, and that women could own property. Most important, they wanted women to have the right to vote. But they did not support Black people getting that right before white women did. They lobbied against the 14th and 15th Amendments, which gave Black men the right to vote, because women were excluded from the bills. It was not until 1920, years after both had died, that all women in the United States could vote. Here's a picture of those two women. back to the story. Harriet learned that the land across from her house was about to be sold. Here was her chance. She didn't have enough money, but a bank loaned her what she needed. Now she could make her dream come true. She moved the men and women she cared for into one of the 2 houses on the new property. Soon, people from all over came to the house. They had read about Harriet's life and wanted to meet her. She had many interesting visitors. People wrote to her too. She received a letter, a medal, and a black silk shawl from Queen Victoria in England. Yet Harriet still had many worries. In 1903, she turned her house over to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. She would still live in the house, but the church would pay the bills. Yet Harriet, who had never asked the people who lived with her for any money, didn't like certain changes made by the church. She said, "When I gave the home over to the Zion Church, what do you suppose they did? Why, they made a rule that nobody could come in without $100. Here's a picture. Now, I wanted to make a rule that nobody could come in unless they had no money. What's the good of a home if a person who wants to get in has to have money?" Harriet was an old woman now. Still, she liked taking walks through town. When she couldn't walk anymore, her grandnieces and grandnephews pushed her in a wheelchair. There's her in a wheelchair. At the age of 92, she could no longer go out, but people still came to see her, and even though she could not read herself, she still had someone read her the newspaper every day. In the spring of 1913, Harriet caught pneumonia. She knew she would not get well. With one of her brothers and some good friends at her side, she died. The town of Auburn decided to honor her. People gathered in the Auburn Auditorium. Flags flew at half-mast. Speakers praised the work she spent her life doing. A bronze plaque was placed on the front entrance of the Auburn courthouse in her memory. It says, "With rare courage, she led over 300 Negroes up from slavery to freedom." Harriet will always be remembered for her courage, for her strength, and most of all, for her fierce devotion to the freedom of her people. What an amazing hero Harriet Tubman was.